How long would the deal be, Mr. President?
Infinite.
Will there speak to Denmark? Did you speak to Denmark?
There is no time limit. It's forever.
And how would you ratify the deal?
Will there be money involved?
It's signed forever.
But you haven't signed anything yet, right?
It's a deal that's forever.
Will there be an effect anyway, Mr. President? Will there be an
No
effect?
money. What happens is people are out there and they're working it right now. They're working the details of the deal, but it's in.
Most political stories start with a headline. This one doesn't. It starts with a quiet signal most people miss. When the people who usually protect power start getting nervous, they don't shout, they adjust. They warn their own side. They speak in careful language meant for donors, not voters. That is what is happening right now. Not because Democrats said something clever, not because cable news got loud, but because the behavior at the center of American power is becoming harder to explain, harder to defend, and harder to sell as strength.
Okay, Katie, one thing that we should also see, Mark is right, the midterms right now look ugly, unless the Republicans really get serious.
When chaos stops helping you and starts costing you, institutions notice first. They always do. And when those institutions begin planning exits this early, it means they see something coming that the rest of the country hasn't fully priced in yet. This is not about personality. It is about risk, political risk, electoral risk, and a governing style that keeps creating more of it. If you care about how power actually breaks, not how it's marketed, stay with this. To understand why this moment feels different, you have to step back before the noise, before polls, before lawsuits, before the daily outrage cycle. There is a long pattern in American politics where parties tolerate instability from their leaders as long as it produces wins. They excuse the mess. They justify the language. They absorb reputational damage because power, for a while, makes it worth it. But that tolerance has limits, and history is very clear about where those limits are. Political parties are not moral actors. They are survival machines. They exist to win elections, protect donors, control committees, and keep influence flowing. When a leader helps with that, almost anything is forgivable. When a leader starts threatening that system, loyalty evaporates fast, not publicly at first, quietly, through editorials, through leaks, through concerns framed as strategy, not values.
All right, Jessica, I'm going to give you the opportunity to praise the president for overseeing the greatest drop in the murder rate of all time.
Well, I'll go like 75% there. Obviously, the trend line started before Donald Trump came into office, and it was embarrassing when everyone on the right was tweeting that graph that ended in 2024. And they were like, I think it started with his sons. They were like, yay, dad. And it was actually Biden's work. But I love a drop in a homicide rate. I love less overdoses. I think this is all good things.
Good.
The rest of it is a disaster, though.
Oh, okay.
The New York Times Santa poll was so bad for him that he's suing the New York Times. Lowest approval rating, -17 immigration, -18 on the economy, -19 on foreign relations, -29 on cost of living. And for those of you that care about the Epstein files, which is a lot of people, -44. The coalition from 2020 is back intact. So young voters, Black voters, Latino voters, back to usual levels of support for the Democratic Party. And J.D. Vance's speechwriter, I think, hates him because he was talking about the economy. And he had this line, you don't turn the Titanic around overnight. But we all know what happened to the Titanic.
Oof.
Oof.
You do.
Sick burn.
We have seen this before. In the early 1970s, Republicans did not abandon Richard Nixon because they suddenly discovered ethics. They abandoned him when it became obvious that the damage was spreading down ballot. When Senate races looked vulnerable, when donors started hedging, when the White House became a liability instead of a shield. The shift did not begin with voters. It began with institutions deciding the cost-benefit math had flipped. That same institutional instinct showed up again decades later during the George W. Bush years. The Iraq War was defended aggressively until it wasn't. Once public trust collapsed and midterm losses piled up, the party did not relitigate the past. It distanced itself, softly, strategically. You heard phrases like, mistakes were made. You saw sudden interest in oversight. The point was not accountability. The point was containment. This is how power behaves when it senses danger. It does not argue loudly. it repositions.
He's very happy with
Does it still include you? Does it still include the United States having ownership of Greenland like you've said you wanted?
It's a long-term deal. It's the ultimate long-term deal. And I think it puts everybody in a really good position, especially as it pertains to security and minerals and everything else.
Have you already spoken?
How long is it, Mr. President?
Spoken to other European leaders?
What?
Have you already spoken to other European leaders?
Yes, I have.
How long would the deal be, Mr. President?
Infinite.
Will there
There is no time limit. It's forever.
And how would you ratify the deal?
money involved?
It's signed forever.
But you haven't signed anything yet, right?
It's a deal that's forever.
Will there be an effect anyway, Mr. President? Will there be an
No
effect?
money. People, what happens is people are out there and they're working it right now. They're working the details of the deal, but it's what's called an infinite deal. It's forever.
You talked about
There's no time cap.
being concerned, Mr. President, about Russia trying to come and take over Greenland. If you're worried that Putin would do something like that, why invite him to join your board of peace?
Because we want everybody. We want all nations. We want all nations where people have control, people have power. That way we're never going to have a problem. This is the greatest board ever assembled. And everybody wants to be on it. But yeah, I have some controversial people on it, but these are people that get the job done. These are people that have tremendous influence. And if I put all babies on the board, there wouldn't be very much. So he was invited. He's accepted. Many people have accepted. I don't know of anybody that hasn't accepted. But it's going to be great. I think the Board of Peace will be the most prestigious board ever, and it's going to get a lot of work done that the United Nations should have done. And we'll work with the United Nations, but the Board of Peace is going to be special. We're going to have peace. It started off with Gaza, the Middle East. We've got peace in the Middle East, tremendous peace in the Middle East. Nobody thought that was possible. And that happened by taking out the Iran nuclear threat. Without that, it could have never happened. But the board is going to be, I think, really fantastic. And I think it'll be the most prestigious board of any board ever in world history.
It prepares narratives for life after the current moment. And that repositioning almost always starts before the public realizes anything has changed. Now look at the present. Donald Trump is not new to chaos. Chaos has always been his governing language. What is new is the timing and the accumulation. Early in a term, parties usually get a grace period. Allies close ranks, media partners soften edges, polls are dismissed as temporary. That is the normal rhythm. But this time, the warnings are coming early. Not from critics, from within the conservative ecosystem that has spent years insulating Trump from consequences. That matters because those outlets exist for a reason. They are not neutral observers. They are instruments of coalition maintenance. They speak to donors, to business leaders, to suburban voters who want tax cuts without drama. When those voices start openly describing chaos as a threat, they are not trying to persuade the left. They are signaling to the right that something is wrong with the current trajectory.
82% of people saw that video. 53% think that he should be criminally charged for it. And then the Wall Street Journal comes out and they're reporting that there are incentives for ICE agents because they need to meet that insane 3,000 people a day quota, that they're getting rewarded even if they bring in people who then get released. These stories of Americans being detained saying, show me your papers. There was a veteran, U.S. veteran who's on a Carnival cruise,
being arrested and
a U.S. veteran on a Carnival cruise with his wife who was taken out of his cabin, someone who served this country.
What is the percentage?
U.S.
No percentage.
citizen. Do
I know
not
math is
act
hard.
like ICE isn't making, I don't even know how many mistakes a day in pursuit of Stephen Miller's 3,000 a day quota and getting paid for it.
We've all seen the 3-minute video. And I've heard some people say, oh, it's hard to watch. What was hard is that there were 5 to 7 ICE agents there. In my world, my colleagues, we've arrested some dangerous people on the back roads of Cumberland County with 3 or less deputies. Yet, this was a show of force, a show of whatever they were trying to do with 7 people. What's even more disturbing is the comment made by the witness that videotaped this encounter, who said that in the 3 minutes they got out, they pulled a guy from the car, handcuffed him, put him in the car, they all took off, leaving his car with the windows down, the lights on, unsecure, and unoccupied. They left it right on the side of the street. Folks, that's Bush League policing. Again, in my world, you wait for a wrecker. You wait for somebody to come pick it up that the individual wants. Or you get permission to drive the vehicle into a public parking spot and you lock it up and you give the person their car keys. You don't leave their personal belongings unsecure along the streets of the city of Portland. It's not fair to the guy that owns the car. It's surely not fair to the Portland police. And it's what my understanding is going on. I'll end with this. We're being told one story, which is totally different than what's occurring or what occurred last night.
This is not about one comment or one policy. It is about predictability. Markets hate unpredictability. Allies hate unpredictability. Campaigns hate unpredictability. Governing coalitions are built on the assumption that tomorrow will look roughly like today. What Trump offers instead is constant disruption, not as a tactic, but as a default. That works in rallies, it works on social media, it becomes a liability when every week introduces a new variable that candidates down the ballot have to explain away. The context that matters most here is not Trump versus Democrats. It is Trump versus institutional patience. And patience is thinning because the cost of defending him is no longer abstract. It is showing up in polling, in courtrooms, in diplomatic relationships, and in internal party strategy conversations that never make it to television but always shape what happens next. This is the lens through which everything else needs to be viewed. Not outrage, not fandom, risk assessment. When institutions that once thrived on chaos start warning about it, they are telling you that the math has changed. And when the math changes, behavior follows. The shift becomes clearer once you look at the concrete actions, not the commentary around them. This is where things stop being theoretical and start becoming measurable. Because institutions don't react to vibes, they react to data points stacking up in uncomfortable ways. Start with polling, not the cherry-picked numbers waved around on social media, the internal stuff campaigns actually use. Approval ratings underwater across multiple issue areas at once, not just one weak spot, but broad erosion. Immigration, the economy, foreign relations, cost of living. These are not niche concerns. These are the pillars presidents rely on to protect their party during midterms. When all of them trend negative at the same time, strategists don't debate messaging tweaks. They start planning defensive exits. Then there's the behavior itself. The governing style has become a recurring source of disruption rather than a vehicle for outcomes. Public statements that rattle allies without delivering policy gains, announcements floated without process, reversals that happen fast enough to spook markets but slow enough to create confusion. This isn't strength projecting outward, it's volatility radiating inward, forcing Republicans in swing districts to answer for things they didn't decide and can't explain. Foreign policy is a clear example. Long-standing alliances depend on trust and predictability. When those are undermined publicly, even rhetorically, the damage isn't abstract. It shows up in diplomatic resistance, stalled cooperation, and quiet recalculations by partners who start hedging their bets. That kind of fallout doesn't disappear when the news cycle moves on. It lingers, and it becomes something every Republican candidate has to inherit whether they like it or not. Domestically, immigration enforcement has turned into another pressure point, not because enforcement itself is new, but because the execution has become visibly chaotic. Reports of aggressive tactics, quota-driven behavior, detentions that generate viral footage, and public backlash. veterans, legal residents, ordinary people caught up in displays meant to signal toughness rather than competence. Each incident becomes a local problem with national fingerprints. Each one forces mayors, governors, and congressional candidates to answer questions they would rather avoid. What makes this phase different is that these are not isolated flare-ups, they are layered. One controversy doesn't resolve before the next one begins. There's no reset, no clean break, just accumulation. And accumulation is deadly in politics because voters might forgive a single mistake, but they don't forget a pattern. Even conservative media outlets that once framed every criticism as partisan noise are now pointing directly at the behavior itself, not defending it, not spinning it, labeling it a liability. That is a critical distinction. When friendly institutions stop translating chaos into strength, they are signaling that the translation no longer works. Add to this the legal backdrop, court cases, investigations, ongoing scrutiny that keeps Trump in a defensive crouch instead of a governing posture. Every appearance becomes a potential landmine. Every statement carries risk. That might energize a base that thrives on conflict, but it exhausts everyone else. And midterms are not won by exhausting swing voters. This is the first real escalation point, the moment where warning signs turn into structural problems, where party leaders start asking not, how do we defend this, but how long can we afford to? That question doesn't get asked out loud. It gets answered quietly through strategy shifts, resource allocation, and increasingly cautious distance. Once you zoom out far enough, the individual incidents stop looking random. They start lining up. Different agencies, different states, different headlines, same underlying pattern. Authority exercised without discipline, power used for display instead of results, and institutions forced to clean up after the spectacle. This is where repetition matters. Not rhetorical repetition, structural repetition. The same kind of problem showing up in different places, under different circumstances, producing the same kind of fallout. That is how you know you are no longer dealing with a one-off controversy. You are dealing with a governing pattern. Take enforcement agencies. When quotas become the story, enforcement stops being about law and starts being about numbers. That shift changes behavior fast. Agents are pressured to act first and justify later. Supervisors reward volume over judgment. Mistakes increase, public trust drops, and every mistake becomes evidence, not just of poor execution, but of a system that incentivized it. That is not a messaging problem, that is a design problem. Now, layer in how those actions land publicly. Video doesn't lie in the way press releases do. When people see veterans detained, families disrupted, cars left on the side of the road, it doesn't matter how many policy memos get issued afterward. The image sticks. And because it keeps happening, the image becomes a narrative, one the administration does not fully control anymore. At the same time, look at how foreign leaders are reacting. Not with press conferences, with distance, with delays, with careful phrasing that signals discomfort without open confrontation. Allies don't usually break publicly unless they have already adjusted privately. That quiet recalibration is happening now, and it has consequences. Trade negotiations slow, security cooperation becomes conditional, diplomatic goodwill evaporates. None of that shows up as a single dramatic failure. It shows up as friction everywhere. Inside the Republican Party, the pattern recognition is unmistakable. Candidates in competitive districts are changing how often they mention Trump. Fundraising emails are getting vaguer. Policy discussions are being localized. You don't see this on cable news. You see it in what isn't said, in who gets invited to events, in which surrogates get deployed, and which ones quietly disappear. This is how institutional self-preservation works. No dramatic break, no public divorce, just incremental separation driven by risk management. The same way corporations distance themselves from toxic brands before lawsuits hit. The same way donors hedge before a crash. The same way political parties prepare for losses they see coming before voters do. What ties all of this together is not ideology, it's exposure. Every additional controversy increases exposure. Every unresolved issue compounds the last one. And because the governing style refuses to slow down, there is no decompression phase, no moment for recalibration, just continuous escalation. That is why warnings are getting louder and earlier, not because elites suddenly grew a conscience, because they recognize a familiar arc, one where chaos stops mobilizing support and starts mobilizing opposition, one where institutions that once absorbed damage decide they've absorbed enough. At this stage, the story is no longer about whether Trump can survive another scandal. He has done that many times. The story is whether the systems tied to him can survive the accumulation of all of them at once. This is the point where politics stops being theoretical and starts colliding with law. Not campaign law, not ethics rules that get argued away on cable panels, actual institutional constraints that don't care about rallies or loyalty. Courts, agencies, statutes, the parts of the system designed specifically to slow down people who refuse to slow themselves down. What matters here is not whether any single legal challenge succeeds. Focusing on verdicts misses the pressure mechanism. The real impact is cumulative exposure. Every investigation ties up time. Every filing creates discovery. Every court date forces preparation. Governing under that weight changes behavior whether anyone admits it or not. Trump's second-term environment is legally hostile in a way his first never was. Judges are not hypothetical anymore. Precedents exist. Records exist. Testimony exists. Actions taken now are being evaluated through a much thicker paper trail, and that trail does not reset with messaging, it only grows. This affects agencies first. Career officials become cautious, not out of resistance, but out of liability awareness. Orders get slow-walked, legal reviews get longer, decisions get layered with approvals. That is not sabotage, that is self-protection. When the risk of later scrutiny rises, institutional reflexes kick in. Congress feels it too. Oversight is no longer abstract. Committees know exactly where pressure points exist because they've used them before. Subpoenas are easier when records are public. Hearings are sharper when timelines are documented. Even members who support Trump politically have to calculate how much exposure they want personally. Loyalty has limits when legal consequences enter the picture. State governments add another layer. Attorneys general do not answer to the White House. State courts do not take direction from federal messaging. Parallel proceedings mean parallel risks. Even if one track stalls, another keeps moving. This is what makes the environment fundamentally different from past cycles, where legal issues could be framed as distant or partisan. The result is institutional drag, not a dramatic stop, a grind. Policies take longer, announcements get hedged, agencies hesitate, foreign partners wait, markets react. None of this looks like a crisis in isolation. Together, it creates the sense of a presidency pushing against resistance on every front at once. For Republican lawmakers, this is where discomfort turns into strategy. They know midterms are referendums, not debates. Voters don't parse legal nuance. They feel instability. They feel exhaustion, and they punish the party in power for it. That is not a theory. That is a pattern repeated over decades. The most important thing here is that the law does not need to deliver a final judgment to shape political outcomes. Process alone can do that. Delay alone can do that. Uncertainty alone can do that. And all three are now baked into the governing environment. This is the escalation point, where chaos becomes expensive in concrete ways, not just reputationally, operationally, legally, institutionally. And once that cost becomes visible to party leadership, patience erodes fast. By this stage, the consequences stop being confined to Washington. They spread outward, into campaigns, into state houses, into the everyday calculations of people who are not obsessed with politics but still have to live under its outcomes. This is where accountability pressure stops being an abstract moral concept and turns into something mechanical. Midterms are unforgiving. They don't ask voters to choose a president. They ask them whether the last 2 years felt stable or not, whether prices made sense, whether the country felt predictable, whether institutions looked like they were working. That is the test, and it is brutal for administrations built on constant agitation. Republican candidates already feel this tension. In districts that matter, they are being asked questions they cannot deflect with slogans, about tariffs that change without warning, about allies publicly confused by American leadership, about immigration enforcement that looks improvised rather than professional, about whether chaos is a strategy or a loss of control. Every answer carries risk. Silence carries risk too. Donors notice before voters do. Money is the most honest signal in politics. When contributions get delayed, rerouted, or quietly redirected to state races instead of national ones, it is not ideological, it is defensive. Big donors do not like uncertainty. They especially do not like being tied to brands that feel radioactive in swing districts. When the governing style itself becomes the liability, checkbooks close fast. Then there is the base versus broader coalition problem. Trump can still energize his core supporters. That has never been the question. The problem is that midterms are not won by base turnout alone. They are won on margins. Independents, suburban voters, younger voters, groups that do not respond well to constant crisis. The more the administration leans into provocation, the more it hardens opposition and shrinks the persuadable middle. Accountability pressure also shows up internationally. Foreign governments do not vote in U.S. elections, but they absolutely respond to instability. Investment decisions slow, cooperation becomes conditional, deals get postponed. Each delay feeds domestic economic anxiety, which feeds political vulnerability. It is a feedback loop, one the White House does not fully control. What makes this phase dangerous is that there is no single fix. You cannot message your way out of accumulated distrust. You cannot undo months of volatility with one disciplined week. The system remembers. Voters remember. Institutions remember. And they adjust accordingly. This is why you are seeing pressure come from multiple directions at once. Media that once defended now warns. Party strategists talk about headwinds instead of momentum. Legal scrutiny keeps churning. None of these forces alone would be fatal. Together, they narrow the margin for error to almost nothing. At this point, accountability is no longer about whether Trump personally faces consequences. It is about whether the political ecosystem around him decides the cost of protection has become too high. That decision rarely gets announced. It gets implemented quietly, through distance, through hedging, through preparation for outcomes leaders would rather not admit they expect. And once that preparation starts, it is very hard to reverse. What comes next does not arrive as a single event. There will be no clean break, no moment where a narrator says, "This is where it turned." That is not how institutional unraveling works. It happens through accumulation, through weight, through systems bending before they snap. The warning signs are already embedded in how carefully allies speak, in how often they redirect, in how rarely they defend without qualification. Those are not rhetorical choices. They are survival instincts. When power senses instability, it stops making emotional commitments and starts making logistical ones. The presidency does not exist in isolation. It drags an entire party behind it. Every candidate, every committee, every donor, every local official who has to stand in front of a room and answer for decisions they did not make. The longer volatility continues, the harder that defense becomes, not morally, practically. There is also the question of attention. Chaos demands it, constantly, but attention is a finite resource. Voters can only process so much disruption before they tune out or turn against the source. Institutions know this. They track fatigue. They measure saturation. When exhaustion sets in, even loyal audiences begin to disengage. Legal processes will keep moving, whether the White House wants them to or not. Courts do not pause for election cycles. Investigations do not wait for messaging resets. Records continue to accumulate. Each month adds context that future judgments will rely on. Nothing expires quietly. International partners are already adjusting, not dramatically, methodically. They will continue to hedge, to diversify, to prepare for multiple outcomes. That preparation itself becomes a signal, one that markets read, one that investors respond to, one that feeds domestic anxiety in ways that cannot be spun away. Inside the Republican Party, the real decisions are happening off-camera, in strategy sessions, in fundraising calls, in conversations about what happens if the map looks worse than expected. Those conversations do not mean abandonment. They mean contingency planning. And contingency planning is the clearest indicator that confidence has eroded. This is the unresolved tension at the center of the moment. A presidency that thrives on escalation, a political system that punishes it over time. A party caught between a base that demands loyalty and an electorate that increasingly demands stability. There is no easy synthesis there. Nothing in this story resolves cleanly. The forces in motion do not cancel each other out. They stack, they compound, they carry forward. And whatever comes next will not be shaped by one speech or one vote, but by how much instability the system can absorb before it decides to protect itself. That decision has not been made yet, but the preparations suggest many actors are already assuming it might be.